Okay, we are going to be in Mark chapter 9 tonight. Mark chapter 9. And I know some folks either weren't there this morning, Mark and Sheila, as well as, Pat, of course, you weren't there. And so the study tonight is from Mark chapter 9. And for the directions, I just wanted folks to go through Mark chapter 9 and kind of make a brief outline of it, just a brief outline, just so you can kind of see some of the forest rather than the trees for what we're going to be talking about tonight. And Mark 9, the last two verses, I thought we would just go ahead and read those. We don't have time to read the whole chapter, of course. But this is Mark 9 at verse 49. It says, "For everyone will be seasoned with fire, and every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. Salt is good, but if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another." So it's that idea of having peace with one another, as we have started a new study on Sunday nights, thinking about all of the different one another's. This evening, we're just going to be thinking about having peace with one another. But would someone like to just go through the chapter and just briefly mention the things that happen in the chapter? Anybody want to help us out with that? Let's just start with, how does Mark 9 begin? Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I've got the transfiguration first.
Okay.
Then the disciples couldn't cast out the evil spirit.
Okay.
Jesus was able to, and by prayer and fasting.
Yep.
Then he talks about Jesus' betrayal. Then the disciples talked about who's the greatest.
Yep.
And Jesus said, "Be like a little child." And whatever causes you to sin, cast it out, and have salt in yourselves.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty good. You might think about some of the details with each one of those. And so think about the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter speaks without thinking. One of the accounts says, it might be this one. When Peter says, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here," verse 6, because he did not know what to say, and they were greatly afraid. Then, the account of them not being able, they come down the mountain and there's someone there who has a demon possessed, I believe, a son, and the disciples can't cast that demon out. Right. So you have that detail. The business about, Bruce mentioned Jesus talks about his betrayal, verse 32, but they did not understand this saying. They didn't get it. But what they do in the next two verses, when the Lord takes when he took the little child, they'd been arguing about who the greatest one was again. Now, something Bruce did not mention is verse 38 through verse 41. John, and let's see, John answered him saying, "Teacher, we saw someone who does not follow us casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow us." And Jesus said, "Do not forbid him, for no one who works a miracle in my name can soon afterwards speak evil of me." And then verse 42, warning about offenses. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off, such things as that. "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to stumble, it'd be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck." Okay, so you have all of that, and then you have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into our questions. Now, our first question then is, how can jealousy rob us of peace? How can jealousy rob us of peace? Anyone want to tackle that?
Well, for one thing, it deflects us from thinking of spiritual things. You're thinking of more the worldly, earthly kind of things that are going on, and it takes us away from the spiritual things of life, and it causes you to have unrest.
Okay, let's come back to that one. If we're just covetous for our neighbor's donkey, it's like, well, then we're not really thinking about heavenly things. If we're coveting our neighbor's wife, then we're not really thinking about heavenly things. But now, what did you say there at the end, Brenda?
it causes us to have unrest.
So just unrest and a discontentment.
Mm-hmm.
We are not content with what we have. We may not be content with our lot in life. We may not be content with our abilities as they are. Anyone else have anything they want to add? I thought I saw one or two look like they were about to pull the trigger,
Can I?
metaphorically speaking.
I said always striving to be better or have more than others.
Okay.
Kind of what we said already.
Yeah. You know, I wanted you to think about think about the chapter, and that's why I wanted you to outline it. So who does Jesus take up on the Mount of Transfiguration? It's Peter, James, and John, right?
Right.
Now, how do you think the 9 felt about that? And you have like different roles, if you will.
Right.
And it's like, well, you know, I've always wondered how James the Lesser felt about being called James the Lesser. It's like, wait a minute, that's not what his mama called him. His mama called him Jimmy, but he was known as James the Lesser, and that's not James the brother of John. And so there's James the brother of John, and then there's James the Lesser. And so I wanted you to think about, you know, the dynamic of the disciples, where it finally gets to the point where they're arguing about who the greatest is. And there's some jealousy there. And so you think about, you know, you might think about roles within the church. You know, if someone's not a preacher, does that mean they're not important? It's like, not at all. If someone's not an elder, does that mean they're not important? Not at all. You know, as we are all members, again, think about what this whole thing is about. We are members of one another. You know, should the foot be jealous of the hand? It's like, no, there are different roles.
Right.
That's one thing I wanted you to consider. Now, also from the chapter, and so you have that father who brings his son to be healed. Now, I would assume that he brought that son to be healed because others had been healed. And so now others have been healed, and suddenly his son is not healed. All of a sudden, his son's not healed until Jesus comes down. And so I was just thinking about, kind of similar to the first point, but when you see others who have been blessed, and you can be jealous. I'll give you an example, one we touched on in class just briefly. Peter and James are both in prison. And what happens to James? He's beheaded.
It's beheaded.
What happens to Peter? He's rescued. How do you think James felt about that afterward? And it's an odd thing to think about. You know, it would be easy to say, well, why didn't you rescue me? Why did you leave me to be beheaded? And it's just, you might think about that idea when, and there's of course more to it, but when you see others and in your mind, you're thinking, well, others have been blessed more than I have. And it may be a spiritual blessing you're thinking of.
Sure.
And it's easy to be jealous. And jealousy, back to Brenda's point, just generally about discontentment.
Sure.
And it robs you of peace.
I'm sure it does.
Here the disciples they're arguing about who the greatest is. How much peace do you think they had amongst themselves?
Not very much.
Not very much. And so that can also play into it. Again, verse 38 through verse 41, when John says, we saw someone, and remember, they could not, granted, John was up on the mountain. John was not at the base of the mountain, so he was not amongst those who could not cast that demon out. But 9 of them could not cast a demon out. And in the same chapter, they forbid someone who was casting demons out. That takes some audacity. It's like, so we could not cast a demon out, and we forbid someone who was casting a demon
Sure.
out. And so, and they say, we forbid him because he does not follow us. And I was thinking about that idea where we want people to follow the Lord. I understand, Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. We want to be a good example, but ultimately we are not looking for our own disciples.
Right.
We want to make disciples for Jesus. And so if we start trying to make our own disciples, that's where you start getting into 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I'm of Peter, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, and things like that.
Sure.
And it's like, oh, well, I'm jealous of the Baptists because the Baptists have more people than we do.
Sure.
And the Baptists are jealous of the Catholics because the Catholics have more people than they do. The sad thing is, if you carry that through illogically or logically, however you want to phrase it, everybody should be jealous of hell because hell has more people than they do.
Absolutely.
The broad path leads to destruction. If it's just a numbers game, if you're just jealous of the numbers, we'll be jealous of the devil. The devil has many more. And so you might, as you think about jealousy, and the solution, of course, is you learn to be content. You learn to be content with your lot in life and the role you have and the abilities you have, and you're thankful for the Lord's blessings you have, and you learn contentment. Any questions or comments or anything? All right, let's go on to the second question. I'm kind of dragging my feet a little bit tonight. How can our failures rob us of peace? How can our failures rob us of peace? So the disciples could not cast that demon out. What do you think they felt like when that happened?
Failures.
Absolute failures. Peter pipes up, oh, we should build a tabernacle, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, to the point where God has to speak up from heaven and saying, this is my beloved son. Right. Hear him.
Hear ye him. Yes.
And so, you think about some of these failures. I'll mention another one. So they forbid someone from casting out demons. And in the very next verse, Jesus says, whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to stumble, it would be better for him that a millstone were hung around his neck. Well, what had they just done to some individual? They had caused him to stumble, right? The only way he was able to cast out demons was by the power of Jesus. That's the only way. And they had forbid him from doing that because, well, he doesn't follow us. They were causing him undue trouble. And so all of a sudden, it's like there's a lot of failure there. So I was just thinking about, in our lives, how can failures rob us of peace? I won't ask you to list your failures. If you want me to list mine, I will. It's going to be a long list.
Right. Well, it's a stumbling block, of course. Because of
what I mean, Michael, is as we reflect upon ourselves and we examine ourselves and we realize it's like, man, I have let a lot of people down in my life.
Right.
I mean, I have failed repeatedly. And how can that thought process rob us of peace?
Hurts our self-esteem.
Okay. And the follow-up is going to be, what's the solution?
Jesus.
Why?
Because he'll forgive.
Why or how?
He's stronger than we are. We're weak. We know we're weak. So
okay,
we need him for strength.
Okay. And, when we think about our failures, it's like all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Right.
And so it makes us, when we think about our failures, we've been talking about David on Wednesday night, of course, and my sin is always before me. And if we keep that in mind, then we will better remember the only way we stand is by God's grace. we do not stand by our works. We do not stand by our own successes
Mhm.
because we fail a lot.
Sure.
And that's just the truth of it. I mean, you know, again, just think about your, you might think about your parenting.
Mhm.
How many times have you failed as a parent or a grandparent or as a child?
Sure.
You know, any which way you cut it. And it's just, we need grace.
Sure.
And I think it's, and as we think about that idea of
Mhm.
needing God's grace, and it helps us because it's easy to think when we fail, it's easy to think we're worthless.
Mhm.
It's easy to think, oh, well, I just can't do anything. It's like, no, that's not what the Lord says. We are still able to work, even though sometimes we may fail. You know, the disciples who could not cast out that demon, for one thing, they asked Jesus, why could we not do that? And the Lord answers that question. This kind only come out with prayer and fasting. So if you want to deal with that issue, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to discipline yourself. And so he gives the answer, and he tells them why they were having trouble.
Right.
And that's what the Lord does. And I
Right.
guess that's the benefit of Scripture. You see these individuals who
Right.
do fail on a regular basis,
Mhm.
and the Lord helps them through that. And so in thinking about our failures and
Mhm.
how they can rob us of peace, it just takes discipline to not let that happen,
Right.
to not just recoil and say, I just can't do anything and I'm just going
Mhm.
to give up.
Right.
You might think about Judas
Mhm.
and when he committed suicide,
Mhm.
and the sort of mentality he had. And in contrast, of course, with Peter, once again, Peter fails the
Sure.
denial.
Mhm.
But the answer is not, well, I'm just going to go up to Galilee and go back to being a fisherman. It's like, no.
Right.
Do you love me more than these? Feed my sheep,
Right.
tend my sheep. You know, you have, of course, the restoration. Let's go on to the next question. If sin, one of the things that, pardon me, I skipped a question. How can our own knowledge or lack thereof rob us of peace? And what that question pertains to is there in verses 30 through 32, when Jesus spoke about being betrayed.
Mhm.
Verse 32, what do they not do? They don't understand what he's talking about.
Mhm.
So how can our own knowledge or lack thereof rob us of peace? Anyone want to help us out with that?
Well,
And
our knowledge can either convict us or relieve us of the sin. So the more we know,
Mhm.
about what God expects of us and try to come close to that, the more we will be at peace with ourselves and know that we've tried to do our best.
so what happens if we don't know?
We need to study to find out.
We need to study. So that's the solution. We need to grow in grace and knowledge.
Mhm.
But sometimes, I mean, even good grief, even people who've been Christians for ages and ages, this is like the difference between theory and application. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually
Right.
do it.
Sure.
Mhm.
And so, for example, Pat, I hope you don't mind me using Dave as an example.
No,
When everything was going on with Dave, I'm sure there were times where you sat down, you're like, why is this happening?
yeah.
And so it speaks to sort of like Job. Job is like,
Mhm.
why is this happening?
Mhm.
And you're sitting here hunting for answers.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of what I was thinking of, our own lack of understanding. Now, thankfully, you're to the point where you can scripturally come to grips with it.
Mhm.
But then there's folks who cannot,
Mhm.
because they do not have the knowledge.
Right.
and
Yeah.
they don't understand. And they'll say things like, why does God allow suffering in the world?
Mhm.
And they turn to atheism.
Sure.
And they say, well, obviously God does not exist, because why would an all-powerful God allow suffering?
Mhm.
That whole argument is based on a misunderstanding.
Sure.
They do not understand.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, exactly, Keith. Thank you. Keith says, there is no God, they say. It's like, no, there is a God. Okay, well, why does he allow suffering? Because he knows the good that can come from it. According to James chapter 1, count it all joy when you fall into various trials and tribulations and such things as that. But it has to have its perfect work, it says.
Sure.
But people will ask questions when things happen because they don't understand, and they'll say, why is it happening? Does God care? Does God care? And because, and again, so their own lack of knowledge is robbing them of peace. They're starting to doubt the existence of God. They're starting to doubt that God cares. Or like Job's friends thought that God was actually punishing Job.
Mhm.
And so when someone's going through some sort of trial or tribulation, and they may think, oh, well, God's punishing me.
Mhm.
It's like, no, that wasn't the case with Job.
Mhm.
And it's like, no, you don't understand. And so a misunderstanding, yeah, Keith says they are haunted in their own mind.
Mhm.
And that's very much the case. And so their own lack of knowledge is robbing them of peace. So again, back to Pat's original point, growing in grace and knowledge
Mhm.
allows us to have peace because it answers those questions. And so we might, in thinking about have peace with one another, all of these things factor together into being able to have peace. All right, I need to go on. Question number 4. Now, if sin exists in one's own life, what must the person do to have peace?
You have to recognize your sin first.
Okay. Well, and I'm not disagreeing with you. All right,
Mhm.
I'm a sinner, Michael. You got me.
Right.
All right, now what?
You have to understand the sin. You have to repent, of course. You have to stop sinning.
Oh, there's that again. And the figure that he uses here in Mark 9 is, if your eye causes you to sin, what do you got to do?
Look it out.
You got to amputate. You got to pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, if your foot causes you to sin, you got to cut it off. If you do not do that,
Mhm.
then what's going to happen?
You're going to do it again.
The sin spreads, right? It's the picture of gangrene is what it is. And you might think about, in ancient times, how serious of an issue that would have been. I mean, it's still an issue, when someone gets an infection.
Sure.
You might think about people, who like diabetic issues, things like
Mhm.
that. It's like, and they have to start amputating limbs.
Mhm. Sure.
Just think about how much worse it was probably 2,000 years ago.
Man.
And, before, good grief, before penicillin, you read horror stories. What is it? I think it's in the Civil War that infection actually killed more people than bullets did, bullets and
Sure.
cannons and
Sure.
such things as that.
Mhm.
Now, why is that? I mean, those doctors in ancient times,
Mhm.
they were butchers. And it's like, you get an infection in your hand, you got to cut it off. You get an
Sure.
infection in your foot, you got to cut it off. If you don't do it, you're dead.
Mhm. Sure.
And spiritually speaking, that's the point. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed rather
Mhm.
than having 2 hands to go to hell into the fire that shall never be quenched, showing the eternity of damnation. But that's what we have to be willing to do. And again, that's what we have to do in order to have peace.
Mhm.
And, you might think about that picture of nobody wants to cut their hand off.
No.
And it's like, I don't want to lose my hand. And so sadly, what do? The hand remains.
Yeah, they were ignore it. Sure.
And the pain gets worse and worse and worse. And spiritually speaking, it's robbing them of peace.
Sure.
That's what the sin is doing. It is robbing them of peace. And you have to amputate. If you don't amputate it, you know, and so what some of this speaks to is when people are not at peace. It's like, okay, what is it that is robbing you of the peace that the Lord wants you to have? And we have to examine ourselves and think about that question. Okay. So our last question for the study tonight, what must peace be joined with according to verse 50? And what does that mean? The Lord tells them to have peace, but he also mentions something else. And what is it? What do they also have to have? You got to have salt. Have salt in yourselves. What does that mean? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another. What does it mean? What is the picture of have salt in yourselves?
Would that
John,
mean?
would that be? Oh, he's
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, he's not.
Yeah, he is. He's locked up.
Go ahead, Michael, and then Bruce.
Oh, I was just going to say, salt to me is faith. So,
Okay, go ahead, Bruce. And Bruce, you're actually frozen up. Nope, you unfroze. But you are muted.
Okay, go for it.
Go for it.
Okay. Let's see. I was going to say the salt represents, I think, zeal.
Okay. And there are, there's different passages about salt. If salt loses its flavor, it's not good for anything. It's not fit for the dunghill. I think we've spoken before about, and you've probably heard sermons about how they used salt back then. And of course, it was used to flavor food. It was used to preserve food. It was also used to deal, of course, with infection. You might think about gargling salt water. It would draw infection out. I want you to think about spiritual applications. Right? It draws infection out. They would actually, there's a passage, I think in Ezekiel, they would rub newborn babies with salt just in case there was any cuts on them or things like that. And of course, one of the ways salt was used, verse 49, every sacrifice was seasoned with salt. And that was commanded. I think you've probably heard me make the joke before. Even the Lord likes salt. No one tells the Lord to lay off the sodium. But anyway, anyway. So you might think about all of those things and how they were to have salt. We are to have salt with one another. And you think about, faith and zeal, the flavor. You might also think about the ability to draw out sin, right? Deal with infection.
Sure.
The ability to rebuke others. You might think about that. You might, I think one of the things, and the Lord here as he's speaking about it, and when he speaks in other places, it's just the idea of effectiveness. When he says if salt has lost its flavor, it's not good for anything. He's speaking about its effectiveness. And by the way, we'll also add, and yeah, Keith, that was, it's the pulls the infection out. He pulls the poison out, pulls the infection out. And I just lost my train of thought.
Well, you can consider salt. It's actually, the way you've been talking, it's an active ingredient.
Right. Yeah. The way salt loses its flavor is the sodium chloride breaks down and it mixes with other things. And so you might think about worldliness and the effect that worldliness has on spirituality.
Sure.
That it dilutes the salt until the salt doesn't have any flavor. Anyone have any comments, questions, or anything? I'm not quite done with that point, but
didn't they in the old times, the ancient times, didn't they actually pay with salt?
Yep, that's what led to the phrase "a man is worth his salt."
Mhm.
or not worth his salt.
Right.
It was a ration, and I believe soldiers were,
Mhm.
and in ancient times as well. Anyway, one of the questions we had was, what might unsalty peace look like? What might unsalty peace? You know, one of the passages we read this morning, or at least
Mhm.
alluded to, when the Lord said, my peace I give you, not as the world gives it. A lot of people, what are they looking for? They're looking for worldly peace.
Right.
They're not looking for the peace of God that passes understanding.
Mhm.
And so what might unsalty peace look like?
Unusable,
Unusable.
lost its power.
Okay. I can't remember who I was talking to this morning. I think it might have been Brendan Lois. Let me check my time. Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left. Mom and Dad knew an older couple. It's the story about the tea, Brenda. They knew this older couple when this fell, and I can't remember if it's tea or coffee, honestly. But he would always ask his wife. He thought her tea was too strong, and so she was trying to accommodate him. And I can't, like I said, it may have been coffee. I can't remember. Anyway, so she kept making it weaker and weaker. And oh, it's just too strong. It's just too strong. Until finally she decided to just get brown cups and just put in water and add a little sugar. And it was just sugar water. And he said, oh, this is the best tea I've ever had. And the sad thing is, a lot of people just want sugar water.
Sure.
You know, if you have a sore throat, how much do you enjoy gargling with salt water? That's not the most enjoyable thing.
No.
I would much rather gargle with sugar water,
Mhm.
right? And you think about, so you might think about what unsalty peace might look like.
Mhm.
It might be sugar instead of salt. And it's someone who might not be interested in rebuking sin and dealing with things along those lines. It might also just look like a person being passive.
Mhm.
You know, they're just passive. They're not, there's nothing there. And I would suggest the world is pretty much like that, especially the religious world. You know, in the religious world we live in, where in most places the only sin is when you actually judge sin. When you actually say something's wrong, that's the only thing that's wrong. When you say something's wrong, they are so passive.
Mhm.
They are absolutely terrified to make a stand for anything.
Mhm.
They've lost their salt. There's no salt there. It's all sugar or nothing.
Right.
So anyway, the Lord wants us to be at peace, but the Lord also wants us to have salt within ourselves. It's not just worldly peace. It's not passive peace.
Mhm.
It's being effective for others. We got about 3 minutes left. Anyone have any questions or comments or anything? I'm not seeing any hands go up. All right. We'll go ahead and close up shop there for the night then. Appreciate y'all being on here. Mark and Sheila, glad y'all made it back. Sheila, I won't ask you to get on the microphone. I was told by Margaret this morning, your voice is doing wonderfully.
Well, kind of, sort of. It's better. It's
Okay.
getting there,
Okay.
but it's got a ways to go.
All right. All right. Well, glad y'all made it back safely. I hope y'all had a good time today. Pat, good to see you tonight.
You too.
How much more time you got down there?
I should be leaving here June 4th.
June 4th. Mark
It's
your
another week.
calendars.
Another week.
All right. Enjoy it. Good to see everyone on here tonight. Appreciate
Thank you.
the attention and the comments and everything. Everyone take care this week.
Bye-bye.
And appreciate y'all.